Thank you very much, Philip. Thank you very much for the invitation to you, and thank you very much to the Northern History Society. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today, ladies and gentlemen, to talk to you about, as Philip indicated, the Lord Edward's March of Lordship, 1254 to 72. So in this talk, I'm going to be discussing the Lord Edward's March of Lordship, as I say, in the time before he became king, the time commonly referred to as his apprenticeship, 1254 to 72. Although there was no official coming of age ceremony for Edward in 1254, he was thrust onto the political stage as a medieval lord, hereafter to be counted among the most influential figures within and across the Plantagenet dominions and beyond. The foundation of his new status was the appanage, loosely defined perhaps as a sizable grant of lands awarded to him by his father, King Henry III, at the start of 1254. The structure of the talk will be as follows, as you should see on the screen, on the screens. Phase one is going to deal with the first 4 years, which I've asked the question as to whether or not it's a baptism of fire. I'm going to be demonstrating why I believe it was, what the key events. Phase two, dealing more specifically with the 1260s, the early 1260s, and the trials and tribulations of the Lord Edward's March of Lordship at that point in time. And then phase three, which is going to look at the March of Lordship in and around Evesham, the Battle of Evesham on the 4th of August 1265. And I'm going to be explaining why I think that this is a period of transition. So I'm going to be drawing attention to some key themes of Edward's lordship along the way, including Edward's administration of his estates and officials, certain aspects of Edward's military lordship, and Edward's politics and patronage too. So let's go straight into phase one. Here are some key events. I like a top 10. I hope that most of you like a top 10 too. I'm not going to pub quiz style ask you these later or throughout the paper, don't worry, but by all means feel free to note some down and use them for the questions if you see fit to do so. And just by way of a brief reminder, that an audience such as yourselves probably needs no such reminder, I'm sure, but here is one anyway, a map of Wales and the Welsh March and the regions that we're going to be talking about, or the region we're going to be talking about today, from the start or before the start of the period I'm talking about, until the end of, well, so I've got C1300 there. And also a more detailed map, perhaps, noting, of course, please, Cardigan, Kilgerran, Carmarthen, Wilth Lordship here, Wilth in particular, the three castles, and the Featherlad, which will be cropping up in my talk, the middle county, the King's conquests, however you want to refer to it, Ross, with Foniog, Diffrin Clwyd, and Tygaingal, or Englefield. So the Lord Edward received his appanage on the 14th of February 1254. Henry III instructed Alan Lazouche, then Justice of Chester, alongside Robert Warrant, the King's steward, and other royal agents to give full possession to Edward or to his attorney of his estates in Cheshire and the March of Wales. Similar orders were sent to all other constables of Edward's English, Welsh, Irish and Gascon estates, and the appanage was later confirmed under the Great Seal on the 22nd of August 1254. In England, as we can see on screen, the Lord Edward thus acquired the whole county of Chester, with its castles, towns and appurtenances, alongside Peveril Castle in Derbyshire, the town of Bristol with its castle, Stamford and Grantham in Lincolnshire, the manor of Fremantle in Kingsclere, and all the lands formerly held by the Countess of Alix de, itself a confirmation of estates previously awarded to Edward, principally in Yorkshire, including the castle and honour of Tick Hill. Map of Edward's estates in North Wales and the March then. So in Wales, Edward received the 4 cantrefs of the Featherlad, Ross, Rhifoniog, Diffrin Clwyd and Tygaingal, or Englefield. This included the royal strongholds at Dyserth and Ganwy in North Wales, as there are up here. The honour of the 3 castles, Grosmont, Skenfith and White Castle, down here, and the castles of Montgomery, Carmarthen, Cardigan and Wilth. All these lands were to be held on the strict condition by Edward that they were not to be alienated from the English crown. Today, as I say, I'm going to be focusing on this or that Welsh or Marcher aspect of the appanage, Edward's March of Lordship, and for the purposes of this talk, alongside the relevant landholdings in Mid and South Wales, I'm including the 4 cantrefs of the Featherlad in my discussion. However, I should just quickly mention, and I will try and be brief, what Edward received elsewhere as part of his appanage too. In Ireland, Edward effectively received the entirety of the royal lordship. He later gained the lucrative cities of Dublin and Limerick and the town of Athlone, which were omitted in the initial grant, but included in Henry's confirmation of the appanage. Only the Irish lands promised to Geoffrey de Lusignan and Robert Warrant, worth £500 and £40 respectively, were initially exempted. The islands of Guernsey and Jersey were handed over, as were the other islands of the sea. And Henry also reconfirmed his earlier bequests to Edward of Gascony and the Isle of Oleron. Far from the march, I know. All of this is to say, however, that the Welsh will march a part of Edward's appanage. The territorial configuration of his march of lordship, if you will, was but one, albeit very significant, part of a much larger whole. This was a vast and complicated inheritance, combining a mixture of estates from across the Plantagenet dominions. Why am I showing you a map of Aquitaine? Well, really, as others have demonstrated, the appanage was the result of Henry's continental ambitions, specifically in this case, the king's aim of securing what was left of the Plantagenet dominions on the continent. Edward's appanage then was born out of a need to secure the Duchy of Gascony, as others have highlighted. The Plantagenets were not the only claimants to the duchy. The Castilians, specifically King Alfonso X, King of Castile, maintained strong claims to it as well. To overcome this, Henry III entered into negotiations with Alfonso X regarding Edward's possible marriage to Alfonso's sister, Eleanor of Castile. Negotiations produced an agreement in March 1254, around 1254, and Edward and Eleanor were married in Alfonso's presence at Las Guargas near Burgos in Spain, around November 1254. All told then, the appanage was supposed to render some £10,000 per annum for Edward. This was a chief condition of the marriage agreement agreed to by Alfonso X. It never fully materialised, however. As Michael Prestwich suggested, the figure was probably more like £6,000 per annum, and that despite Henry granting Edward additional properties to make up the shortfall. Still, despite the debate over incomes, Edward's appanage transformed Edward's wealth and position. Here is Edward, and here is his bride Eleanor of Castile. Married, knighted, and invested with vast estates, and all in the same year, Edward turned 15. Not bad going, eh? 1254 was of prime significance in Edward's young life, hence why I've spent so much time talking about it. And not long after the marriage and belting ceremonies in Spain were over, Edward and his new bride Eleanor travelled back to Edward's Duchy of Gascony, where Edward remained for around 12 months. Now, reasons for his staying on the continent relate specifically to the challenges of the duchy itself, which I shall not reiterate here, that is to say that Edward sought or was given reason to interact directly, so far as he was able, with his Gascon estates and tenants straight away. So, back to terra firma then, to the Lord Edward's March of Lordship. Just a reminder, here is the return of that map. The early years from 1254 to 58 of Edward's March of Lordship were far from straightforward. They provided something of a baptism of fire for Edward, as we'll see. They were dominated by political wrangling and violence in March, mainly between himself and other marchers. And the leading force in Gwynedd of the day, Llewellyn ap Griffith, a grandson of Llewellyn the Great, and very arguably Edward's greatest ever Welsh opponent. In Wales and the March, Edward's record before 1258 was founded upon his rivalry with Llewellyn, specifically their contest in Edward's lordship of the Featherled, on screen, which had consequences for the rest of Edward's lands in the Welsh March. Before discussing this contest, I must say a few words, as I promised at the start, about Edward's administration of his March of Lordships and the reputation of his officials operating in his name throughout the March at this time. Now, as was only to be expected, Edward keenly interacted with his March of Lordships and his estates in North Wales. Like most medieval lords, Edward relied upon his officials to oversee the administration of his lands and to reap their profits and rewards as much as they could to his advantage. And on the 10th of May, 1254, Edward issued his writs as a Marcher Lord. Within weeks of being awarded his appanage then, these writs concerning, among other things, the appointments of his officials, many of whom we can see on the screen here, prove Edward took a direct interest, I would argue, in the administration of his Welsh and Marcher estates from the start. On the 24th of May, Edward acknowledged and confirmed Geoffrey de Langley's appointment as his chief steward for, quotes, as long as it will have pleased us, that is to say, Edward, number one here under stewards and bailiffs, and we're going to be hearing a lot more about him in a second. Margaret Howell and others have highlighted that Langley's appointment was not of Edward's own choosing or making. Still, Langley and Edward formed a relationship of sorts over time, and Langley was largely beholden to Edward and increasingly looked to him for reward and advancement. Interestingly, Edward omitted the Featherled and Chester from Langley's jurisdiction, which remained in others' hands, but Langley nevertheless exercised considerable influence over Edward's lands and his other officials. Between 1254 and October 1255, Edward instructed Langley on no fewer than 12 occasions. These orders varied from obtaining large loans from his uncle, Richard of Cornwall, to the reimbursement of Florentine merchants, to the gathering of 200 vessels in England for a consignment of lead bound for Gascony, a real mixture, if you will. In almost all cases, Langley received these orders directly from Edward himself and carried them out on his behalf. Edward's other officials are discoverable in a range of sources, and these are also, as I say, on screen. These officials include Robert le Wallace, Edward's steward of Wilth Castle, about which we'll be hearing, Robert of Ludham, Edward's bailiff of Ayton in Wrexham, and Roger le Eyre, Edward's bailiff of Horton in Cheshire. Also one William de Wilton and Roger le Eyre, Edward's bailiff of, also one William de Wilton served Edward in the Midlands and the March. In September 1256, 35 armed horsemen and 700 footmen were recorded as going to the parts of Llandovery near Carmarthen by the command of Lord William de Wilton. This entry then appears in Edward's account roll under the subtitle Allowances by the Lord Edward's Writ, suggesting Edward himself authorised Wilton's and his forces' expenses. And several of Edward's officials, stewards as well as bailiffs, witnessed his charters, such as his grant to Roger Mortimer in February 1258, about which more in a moment. That's Roger Mortimer, Lord of Wigmore, although I'm sure, as this is the Mortimer History Society, you didn't need me to say who it was. The sources, governmental records and chronicles are full of complaints about Edward's officials, full of them. In the summer of 1256, for example, Robert le Wallace, who had been awarded Wilth Castle, had somehow managed to offend all the men of Edward the King's son of Wilth in those parts. A quotation taken from the governmental records, not from a chronicle. These men alleged Wallace and others had exacted sheep, of all things, and extorted money from them. Wallace escaped punishment and was still steward of Wilth in November 1257. He remained in Edward's service and later even gained custody of Monmouth Castle. The Dunstable annalist described Robert of Ludham and Roger le Eyre as wretched and wicked men, these being the other servants of the Lord Edward. These people, these men, these persons who in one memorable incident deprived the Prior of Dunstable of funds while on the road near Shortgrove in Bedfordshire. Now, admittedly, that's far from the mark, but this behaviour was probably, and I would argue very probably, representative of their wider actions too. The worst offender of all, however, was Geoffrey de Langley. Matthew Paris described how all the Welsh down here suffered Langley's tyranny. Paris described Langley as a knight and royal exactor, and the Welsh rebelled, according to him, having been roused to the defence of their land and to the observation of their laws. The Dunstable annalist agreed Langley had attempted to subjugate the Welsh who were being borne upon to the laws of England. The Tewkesbury annalist, well, Geoffrey de Langley didn't fare much better there either. So in light of these colourful accounts, well worthwhile reassessing Edward's participation in events in North Wales in the mid to late 1250s then. So where was Edward in all this? He'd returned to England from France, to say he stayed in Gascony for around 12 months, and he returned to England on or around the 16th of November 1255. He landed at Dover. His itinerary is well documented afterwards. He remained in England until the 4th of June 1256, when Matthew Paris records him at Blythe in Nottinghamshire. He then appears to have gone to Galloway in Scotland briefly, returned to England via Whithorn, and entered Chester for the first time as its lord on or around the 17th of July 1256. From Chester he journeyed to the Featherlad, the middle county which is on the screen, King's conquests, the Featherlad, again for the first time to survey his lands in North Wales. He crossed back over the River Dee into Cheshire by the 3rd of August and was at a few days later in and around Bristol, back in London by the end of August 1256. What was the result of Edward's first trip to North Wales and his march at Estates then? He will return to that contest in the Featherlad I mentioned before, the big event of these early years and the first major shift in Edward's march of lordship, if you like. This was the rebellion of Edward's Welsh tenants in the Featherlad in late 1256 in December, which prompted the involvement of Llywelyn ap Griffith, according to the Welsh chronicler. Events in 1256 went as follows, here on the screen. This account, taken from the Chronicle of the Princes, was penned around 1330 at the earliest, probably by a Welsh scribe, Appallacrucha. It's neither contemporary nor wholly objective and should be consumed with a very large pinch of salt, but it also cannot be dismissed, especially given the accounts of the English chronicles I've cited before. And the Welsh sources all suggest that Llywelyn made a rapid and astonishing advance through Edward's other lordships in the late 1250s. Llywelyn and his forces marched into Marioeth in December 1256, next into Edward's lordship of Wilth. Flushed with success, you might say, Llywelyn's forces also entered the lordship of Gwerthfawrino, then in the hands of Roger Mortimer, Lord of Wigmore, with whom Edward very quickly and repeatedly made common cause, as we shall see. And at this stage, we can turn to the evidence in some of the governmental records and to letters of complaint made by Llywelyn ap Griffith to learn more. In March 1257, Llewellyn responded to the letters of Richard of Cornwall, Edward's uncle, who had asked him to withdraw from the Featherlad. In response, Llewellyn declared that he had acted, quotes, with the common council of all the magnates of Wales, who were, quotes, then in accord with us. Llewellyn, a cynical view could be taken here, but it's striking to note that Llewellyn made similar claims in 1282, albeit under changed circumstances, when he again refused to leave and surrender his claims to the Featherlad, in which, he declared, he and his predecessors had retained full right since the time of Camber, son of Brutus. Llewellyn repeatedly insisted then that he would not surrender his claims to the region, regardless of the context. After justifying his actions in 1256, Llewellyn complained that when Edward was granted the Featherlad, his own claims had not received due consideration from the king. He also lamented that his earlier complaints concerning royal abuses in the region had still not been addressed, and crucially, singled out Edward personally for complaint. Before Llewellyn attacked the Featherlad, he claimed Edward was not ceasing day and night toward our, that is Llewellyn's, destruction and the destruction of our people, or so he had convincingly heard from excellent and trustworthy people, perhaps convenient. Llewellyn not only challenged Edward's right to govern the Featherlad, he also criticised Edward's governance in no uncertain terms. And this would seem to corroborate the thrust of the English chroniclers' accounts of the awareness and early involvement of Edward in Wales and the March. The next major shift in Edward's march to lordship occurred at the end of this first phase in June 1257, when Edward's forces were roundly defeated by the Welsh loyal to Llewellyn ap Griffith at the Battle of Cymraeg. Results were horrendous for the English, and Edward's armies suffered grievous losses. Contemporaries estimated the death toll at 3,000, almost certainly an exaggeration, but the point is the English suffered a dreadful defeat, while the Welsh enjoyed a great triumph. Professor Sir Rhys Davies concluded that Cymraeg was one of the most devastating defeats, quote, inflicted on an English army in Wales in the 13th century. So in the first 4 years of Edward's march to lordship, he had experienced a rebellion by his tenants in the Featherlad, incursions by Llewellyn ap Griffith and his forces into his other marcher domains, specifically into Mid Wales and Wilt's lordship, and he and his forces suffered a great defeat at the hands of the Welsh at Cymraeg. Like I said, a baptism of fire. And what was the Lord Edward's response to all this? Quickly just want to bring to your attention British Library, Harley MS, manuscript 1240. In the Black Book of Wigmore, a source known to some of you, I don't doubt. This is evidence of the Lord Edward's patronage of Roger Mortimer in the very areas I've been talking about, in Alfeilwch Mynydd, in the southeast corner of Wales. The Old French in the margin makes this very clear to us. There's the manuscript again. And the key points here really are, as I say, that Alfeilwch Mynydd is being granted by Edward to Roger Mortimer. Why, we ask? Well, we don't know whether these lands were in fact in Edward's possession when he granted them. And it's likely, it seems very likely that he's trying, as it were, to bring Roger Mortimer further into his orbit of power, to align himself or themselves closely together so that they can take on the building threat, or by this point, very well built threat, of Llewellyn ap Griffith. And note, please, just quickly here, the witnesses, some names that should be familiar to us from previous slides. Edward was very happy, regardless of the accounts in the chroniclers, Welsh or English alike, even the accounts in the governmental records of their poor behaviour, to associate himself with these men. So, straight into phase 2 then, the Lord Edward's march to lordship and the trials and tribulations of the early 1260s. This is a shorter phase, as is phase 3. The years after 1258, after the crushing defeat at Cymraeg, were no easier for Edward. The following decade, the 1260s, was dominated, generally speaking, by major events in England. The political upheaval commonly referred to as the period of baronial reform and rebellion, or more recently as that of the First English Revolution. I prefer the latter. The two decisive battles of Lewes on the 14th of May 1264 and Evesham on the 4th of August 1265 are well known to most, and for good reason. Both were events which directly involved Edward and impacted his march to estates. So the Lord Edward and the fall of Wilth Castle, and this really is the next major shift in Edward's march to lordship. It occurred at the start of the following decade, as I say. At the centre of this shift was the Lord Edward's stronghold of Wilth. The castle itself occupied a rich point site, a well-chosen site in a defensible position, and it dominated an important fording point on the River Wye, situated to the east of where the River Evesham merges with the River Wye. It was the main fortification guarding the central route into Mid Wales. As king, Edward later built a powerful masonry fortress of Wilth in or around 1277, perhaps proof he saw it as something of a jewel in his crown. That said, it was the smallest example of his new castles, and now, very sadly, only some of the foundations remain. hence the stencil, what I think is actually a very beautiful stencil. The shift in Edward's position during the early 1260s yet again involved his leading Welsh opponent, Llewellyn ap Griffith. Llewellyn first assaulted Wilf on the 10th of January 1260. He was frustrated by the response he received from the English to his most recent complaint about certain marchers' misconduct. As he had done before, Edward looked in desperation to his fellow marchers and to the king for aid. Henry was abroad when he heard the news that Llewellyn had assaulted Wilf, but he responded swiftly. His and Edward's chief concern was to guarantee the defence of the Welsh March, which meant defending Wilf at all costs. Henry instructed Roger Mortimer, then Edward's custodian of Wilf, to address the damages and grievances being done by Llewellyn. He even awarded him 100 marks at the Exchequer to be released to him if it was needed. No fewer than 20 other marcher lords were ordered to go to the march without delay to assist in the relief of this castle. Henry even readied his own household knights who were to go to Wilf if the marchers were unable or otherwise engaged. Henry's orders reveal he well understood the perils of the situation then, and he expressed concern at Llewellyn's actions to his baronial council. If Llewellyn seized it, Wilf, Henry argued, he could, quotes, advance thence through Brecon and Netherwent against our marchlands, which threatened the devastation of those parts. In the event, Llewellyn lifted his siege and departed the lordship before Henry's or Edward's forces arrived. But Wilf's vulnerability and its central importance to the security of the march had clearly been highlighted. And if anyone thought that was the end of the matter, they were sorely mistaken. On the 8th of July 1260, Henry summoned Roger Mortimer, still Edward's custodian of Wilf, to be with him at London to discuss urgent affairs of the king and the realm. Richard de Clare, the Earl of Gloucester and Hertford, Humphrey de Bohun, the Earl of Hereford and Essex, John de Plessis, the Earl of Warwick, they were all in attendance, as were Henry's royal stewards. The Lord Edward himself was also there. And the convening of Parliament, at which so many influential marcher lords had been gathered, meant the march was temporarily without its leading figures, and so was vulnerable to attack. Llewellyn ap Griffith saw his opportunity to strike Westminster on or around the 17th of July 1260. Upon his arrival at court, the news of Llewellyn's capture of Wilf Castle had reached the king and Edward. Although Mortimer was later acquitted of all blame for Wilf's fall, an addendum on the patent roll reveals that Edward was reluctant to exonerate him. This letter, it says, of acquittal was sealed, but afterwards Edward exclaimed against the said release. Edward's reluctance seems reasonable, given Mortimer held Wilf from him before it fell, and Mortimer's acquittal effectively meant Edward had no means of recovering any losses as a consequence of its fall. Indeed, not only had Llewellyn seized Wilf Castle, but he then destroyed it, thus adding insult to injury and further straining relations between Edward and Mortimer. Perhaps an added bonus, perhaps a primary motivating factor. Any disagreement between the two men was short-lived, that is Mortimer and Edward. They were working together again sooner rather than later, but Wilf's loss was a significant blow for Edward and to his authority throughout his march of lords, as I've said on the screen. And some might suggest that as Wilf Castle lay in ruins, so too did Edward's reputation as a marcher figure. Now, according to T.F. Tout, the next 2 years, meaning 1261 and 1262, were fairly quiet in March. And while I disagree with Tout's assertion, for reasons I might discuss afterwards in the questions, in the interest of time here, I'm going to agree with him and move swiftly on. So perhaps the best summary for these years, that is those 1261, 1262, and for the expectations Henry III had of Edward as a marcher lord then, as we don't have an original Charter of Liberties, unfortunately, for Edward, is provided by the passage on screen and by Henry himself, who contacted Edward, then in Gascony, with the following striking and stark message in December 1262. The king to Edward, greetings and fatherly affection. Has heard the whole March of Wales is disturbed on all fronts by terrible dangers, bound for destruction. We command to you, Edward, that you shall come to us in England without the loss of any time, so as to save from loss your castles, lands, and your men, or risk your impoverishment. This passage shows Henry was keen to hasten Edward's return from France. Understandable given recent events in March, especially at Wilf. It also reveals Edward's ongoing power and authority in the region and the role Henry had envisaged for him there. Edward was noticeably told to return, to save his castles from loss, to salvage those of his men, and at the risk, if not doing so, of his impoverishment. He should not wait any longer, Henry claimed elsewhere, but return in January 1263. Vital, he said it was, that he did so for the defence of the march, and as he stated, because we might find few people of those parts who would advance on campaign there without our presence or yours, that's Edward's.
This suggests Henry believed that so long as Edward remained abroad, his tenants would refuse to fight without him, or worse still, might defect to Llewellyn. The Lord Edward's March and Lordship was clearly in peril. Fast forwarding then to the Battle of Lewes and its consequences. Perhaps the next major shift in Edward's March and Lordship, and of historical significance generally, occurred, and this event occurred outside of the March, had major consequences for Edward himself and for his March and Lordship. So yes, it's not in the March. Why is it here? Because of the consequences of what happened there. The battles of Lewes and Evesham, as I say already, may have had their roots elsewhere, but they were impacted by and directly affected matters in the March, including, I would argue, the Lord Edward's March and Lordships. So after the Battle of Lewes on the 14th of May, 1264, Henry III was Simon de Montfort's miserable cipher, to use Dr. Andrew Spencer's memorable phrase, while the Lord Edward was held in captivity, first at Wallingford Castle, and then, ill-advisedly as it turned out, at Hereford Castle. Simon de Montfort, then Earl of Leicester, was at this point at the height of his powers as champion of the reforms, and was de facto ruler of the realm. After Lewes, Simon de Montfort was in a commanding position, as a result of which he seized, among other things, Edward's estates, including Chester Castle, Edward's exchequer at Bristol, and other estates such as his manor of Newcastle under Lyme in Staffordshire. Most of these estates I outlined at the start. The last straw in these confiscations, though, in my opinion, perhaps came on the 16th of August, 1263, when Montfort attempted to commit Cardigan and Carmarthen castles to Hugh de Troubleville, a Montfortian. Again, Lord Edward's imprisonment after Lewes. Here we've got images of Wallingford Castle. Probably going to be seeing a lot of images of castles today, so my apologies for starting this off very early. But sadly, we don't have an image of Hereford Castle, instead of which we have a monument erected on the site of the Bailey of the old castle. Matters quickly changed, is my point, at this during this period. And Edward escaped captivity on 28th of May 1265 in a well-reported, and it has to be said, much embellished in places, incident involving several of his fellow Marcher lords. Where did he escape to? The March. This is why it's important. Thomas de Clare, Lord of Thomond, Roger Clifford, Lord of Clifford and Erdesley, Roger Mortimer, all of these figures from the March were involved in his escape, so we're told. After deceiving his Montfortian handlers, Edward travelled with Mortimer from Hereford to Wigmore and then to Ludlow, hence why they're on screen. Another beautiful stencil drawing here, in my opinion, where Edward met Gilbert de Clare of Gloucester. And this coalition of marchers, then set out to reconquer the March. James Audley, Lord of Knockham in Shropshire, recovered Edward's stronghold of Beeston Castle in Cheshire on the 31st of May. Chester Castle was recovered around the 7th of June, alongside the strongholds at Shrewsbury and Bridgenorth, while Ludlow Castle remained well defended by Edwardian forces. By mid-June, among the last of the Montfortian strongholds still standing was Gloucester Castle. Apparently garrisoned with Montfort's own household knights, it fell around the 29th of June 1265. So growing increasingly desperate because of events happening in the March of Wales and what this meant to Simon de Montfort's position, Montfort made a good and official alliance with that old opponent and stalwart of Edward's in the Marches, Llewellyn ap Griffith, which effectively sealed Montfort's fate. A version of this treaty was confirmed at Pipton, near Brecon, in Llewellyn's Lordship of Canterbury-Selith on the 19th of June, 1265. Montfort's regime confirmed it on the 22nd of June at Hereford. In return for 30,000 marks, Montfort acknowledged Llewellyn as the holder of the Principality of Wales and as, quotes, all he may have and hold from the king. Still then, Simon de Montfort's miserable cipher. For Henry III, as I say, still Montfort's miserable cipher, this was a humiliating concession. For Montfort, it was a radical but necessary step towards securing his position. For Edward and his fellow marchers, Montfort's alliance with Llewellyn ap Griffith singled him out all the more for punishment. Perhaps as much as anything else, Montfort's alliance with Llewellyn was a constant thorn in the side of Edward and of his fellow marchers, if I can put it like that, was very much the last straw. And the Second Barons' War was concluded not far from the March at Evesham in Worcestershire. I don't wish to trespass on a forthcoming MHS talk, but I will mention Evesham briefly. The Battle of Evesham has been well studied by historians, including Professor David Carpenter and more recently by Dr. Sophie Ambler in her very impressive The Song of Simon de Montfort. Three important points should be restated here, I think. Testament to Montfort's recent treaty with Llewellyn, a considerable Welsh contingent fought at Evesham. According to the scribe of the Flores Historiarium, around 5,000 Welsh foot soldiers were slain in the battle, who, quotes, first went into flight and who, fleeing into cornfields and gardens and all throughout the land, were afterwards found and annihilated. I know it's early in the morning, my apology, in the UK here, so my apologies for that if you're still having your cornflakes. Again, the figures should be handled with great care, but the point is the Welsh were involved in large numbers.
Moreover, all three royalist commanders at Evesham were Marcher lords. The Lord Edward, Gilbert Clare, and Roger Mortimer, excuse me, were all involved. Roger Mortimer allegedly led a hit squad targeting Montfort on the battlefield and was responsible, again, I know it's early in the UK here, but responsible for the mutilation of his corpse. Mortimer's direct involvement is attested by the fact that Simon de Montfort's head was sent to Dame Maud Mortimer, Roger's wife, who, so we're told, foully abused it. It seems plausible that Mortimer wanted to make an example out of Montfort, both for his own actions and for his alliance with Llewellyn, who had earlier ravaged Mortimer's lands and Edward's lands with Llewellyn. The Lord Edward, who may not have known of Mortimer's plans, though perhaps that's unlikely, did not punish Mortimer for his actions, perhaps also telling. As is known, Simon de Montfort came to the most appalling events, as is depicted here from British Library Cotton manuscript Nero. The overriding significance in all this for Edward and his Marcher lordships is clearly that it was his status as a Marcher and his estates in the March which provided Edward with a base, a strong position from which he could resist his opponents and gather his forces under his banner, ahead of Evesham. Edward's Marcherness, if you like, and his Marcher lordships played then a vital role in his wider struggles of the day. And while the Battle of Evesham was impacted by Edward as a Marcher figure, the aftermath was arguably even more significant for his Marcher lordships. And here in phase 3, time is marching on. All I really want to do is take us through some, what I think are very pretty manuscripts, but also very informative manuscripts as well. Here again, some key events, because by now you've probably noticed I like a top 10. I thought I would try, as I say, some hands-on source analysis and discussion in this final phase for about 5, maybe 10 minutes. If that's okay with you, Mr. Chairman. In this final phase of the talk, which might be used to inform or act as prompt for some of the questions. So here we go. So here we are with TNA, a special collections manuscript. Why is this significant? Shows us where the Lord Edward was in the aftermath of Evesham. Yes, he's at Chester. And the terms outlined herein are of surrender proposed for the garrison at Kenilworth Castle. It's often said that he wasn't involved in, as we'll see, the dictum of Kenilworth, which came later. And the conditions outlined here probably explain why. As you can see, Edward to the King of England, Henry III, it is believed to be worthwhile writing to them, that is those in the garrison of Kenilworth, on behalf of our Lord, above said, i.e. Henry, that if they do not wish to be reputed as a public enemy and disinherited, and moreover lose their life as they shall deserve, they are to commit the said castle without delay to our Lord. So here we are, siege of Kenilworth Castle. It's the longest siege in English medieval history. Duration from the 25th of June 1266 to December 1266. It wasn't the great war machine of Henry which broke the backs of the garrison in the end. It was potential starvation. There were allegedly only 2 days of supplies left for the garrison when they eventually left it. And the threat of disease as well, and also being provided with, as we see here, the dictum of Kenilworth in 1266 towards the end. The peace terms which, as Dr. Benjamin Wilde pointed out, on his BBC Sounds podcast in January 2015, if I'm able to. I should not be too BBC about it, but other podcasts are available. He says, allowed the rebels to reclaim their lands in return for a cash fine. But this proved problematic and the garrison fought on for a further 6 weeks until Henry agreed to lower the fines. Probably not what Edward had in mind, I would suggest. Here, TNA, as I say, the National Archives, the Lordship of Lancaster series 10109. Why is this important? Shows us the Lord Edward restoring the 3 castles, that's Grosvenor, Skenfrith and White Castle, to Henry III for the use of his brother, the Lord Edmund. And this is what I mean really by transition. The Lord Edmund, so far as I can tell, replaces his brother, the Lord Edward, as the royal or the crown's lieutenant in the March of Wales. It should be said that he gained at least 3 earldoms after Evesham. One was created for him, Lancaster. One was the earldom of Leicester, thanks to Simon de Montfort, Simon de Montfort's expense and that of his heirs. And the other was at the expense of the rebel earl. He's called the rebel earl in the sources, rebel earl of Derby, Robert de Ferrers. Here we can see the 3 castles. My favourite's White Castle, but I thought I'd give us some images of the castles. Again, more images of castles. Sorry, I think we might be seeing a few today, but I couldn't resist, so my apologies. Very important strongholds. This one actually looks like a castle, which is brilliant considering. that some of them really don't, including, as I say, Wilf earlier. And here we have another manuscript. So the Lord Edward restoring the three classes, as I say, back to the manuscript. And then the key details here, as I've already discussed, I think, of Edward granting, awarding or restoring to his father, who then awards these castles in Edward's presence, it must be said. Whether he's being forced to agree to this, we don't really know, but I would perhaps suggest maybe not. 30th day of June in 1267. So the final part of this phase then, as time is marching on yet again, I just want to draw our attention to the Redistributions, so the ford of Montgomery, the place where many of the Anglo-Welsh peace settlements were discussed, arranged, and also made official, and the Treaty of Montgomery, 29th September in 1267. Excuse me for the error there. Llywelyn will restore to the king all possessions, lands, and rights occupied in the recent war, except for Brecon and Gwerthrynion. That becomes important in a second, with the last manuscript I'll be showing you. According to the customs of the march, disputes will be settled. Wilf he gains. We've mentioned Wilf before. Roger Mortimer, if he can prove his right to it, that is Llywelyn, also gains that. And here, crucially, the king grants by his pure liberality and grace, with the consent of the Lord Edward, to Llywelyn the Principality of Wales. So that Llywelyn and his heirs shall be princes of Wales. And he also gains the feather mentioned previously as well. For the above concessions and grants, Llywelyn paid a very high price, perhaps too high a price by far. See here, 25,000 marks, 1,000 marks shall be paid within a month, 4,000 marks when it's Christmas, 3,000 marks each year at the same term at Chester Abbey, until the whole sum has been paid. Got a lot, but had to pay a hell of a lot for it. And here we are. So this is basically me trying to point out that the Treaty of Montgomery didn't succeed in all areas where it didn't succeed. It did not succeed in drawing to a close or settling those disputes in the March of Wales. Robert Burnell and Walter de Merton to Roger Mortimer. This was the council that was established by this point, as we hopefully saw in the key dates. Edward and Edmund, and indeed Edward's wife Eleanor of Castile, had all gone, or had left at least, for the Ninth Crusade, and Robert Burnell and Walter de Merton and the likes of Roger Mortimer have been left to oversee the estates. And this is on the right versus expediency of defending Brecon. Key bits, as I say, are here. To Roger Mortimer, who had complained and made Robert Burnell and Walter de Merton aware that the Welsh had recently laid waste the land of Humphrey de Bohun, and that is those very significant lands in Mid Wales and Herefordshire, with fire and with pillaging. Yet in truth, having inspected the portion of the peace settlement, he means the Treaty of Montgomery, announced at Shrewsbury and promulgated at Montgomery, we do not understand how he, Humphrey, may prepare to defend the said land against any faithful person of Llywelyn. What to do indeed. It turns out that the divisions and the stresses and the strains, which I've outlined, I hope, quite clearly to you this morning, continued long after the Treaty of Montgomery had been promulgated. Now, I will draw my presentation to a close now with very brief concluding remarks here, Mr. Chairman. On the programme for today's conference is the following quotation: all those things he, Edward, wished to accomplish, he wisely brought to an end. Regarding Edward I, such a statement would give rise to a great deal of discussion and debate. Hopefully it will do. The same could probably be said at the time before Edward became king, perhaps even more so. As a march lord in his own right, it's difficult to conclude that his successes, Edward's successes, outweighed his failures. But one thing is for sure: the March of Wales, its lords, and that old opponent, Llywelyn ap Griffith, remained problems for Edward, problems which he confronted, with which, he would have to confront. Which he confronted with a great deal more success, perhaps, in the early years of his kingship. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind attention. Thank you once again to the Mortimer History Society for the opportunity, and thank you, Philip, once again for your patience and for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Alastair, and I congratulate you. It's I make it 10:45.
Right, I'm very pleased to hear it. I'm sorry that I was 5 minutes over.
No,
I hope that, yeah.
No, it's perfect timing. Thanks, Alastair.
Okay.
And thank you very much. Very clear exposition of the Lord Edward's engagements with the marches, and quite a, as you've very clearly shown us, quite a fraught relationship at the times, but yes, possibly, as no doubt we'll go on to hear from Kathleen, ultimately a good grounding for him in terms of his experiences and development as a lord.
Absolutely.
And as a
Absolutely.
ruler. Kirsten, can you join us, please?
Yes, I'm here.
You're good. And have you received any questions for
I have, so far I've received one, and I expect I'll get a few more as I talk. But Alastair, your first question is, does Edmund take as much interest in his March of Lordships as his elder brother did? Does he keep the same stewards, or does he bring in his own team to manage his estates?
Yeah, great question. So thank you very much for that. Yes, he does. He takes a very keen interest indeed. When he comes back from the Ninth Crusade, his residence of choice, if I can call it a residence, is actually Grosmont. So it's one of the three castles. He also, I mean, just looking at his religious patronage of, or patronage of religious institutions, I should say, Dore Abbey, Wormsley Abbey in Herefordshire. We have a charter as well, or a letter from the inhabitants at the, I think it's St John the Evangelists in Carmarthen, asking for Edmund to involve himself in selection of the new head of their order. And there are many more as well, even with grants to Monmouth Priory. So yeah, no, he takes a very, very keen interest indeed. And it's probably worth just stating at this stage that, you know, from his earldom in Lancaster, it's very much the case that the lessons, as Philip was suggesting there, have by this stage been learned by 1267. I say this stage by 1267, setting Edmund up in a way that Edward hadn't been, arguably. And the expectations of Edmund were, if you like, a little bit more realistic. His power and his power bases were more focused in England and the Welsh March than Edward's had been. So yeah, no, he absolutely takes a very keen interest. We actually have, I should say just very briefly, a Carta Originalis de Libertatibus. So we actually have a charter, an original charter of liberties for Edmund. Whereas one of the closest things that we have for Edward is the quotation that I had up on screen in terms of expectations that Henry III had of Edward in December 1262. But we actually have a Charter of Liberties. I think it's dated the 12th of January 1267. It's National Archives, Duchy of Lancaster Series 10/108, I believe. And it makes for fascinating reading. You know, Edmund basically he gets rights in the March of Wales and is to hold his estates there, crucially, as the other Marcher lords do. So, you know, you could, the arguments there to state that actually Edmund's more of a March lord officially, if you like, at least in terms of the evidence that we have, the excellent evidence that's available than the Lord Edward perhaps ever was. Yeah. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
No, thank you. We have another one here. The Treaty of Montgomery used the phrase, according to the customs of the March.
Yeah.
Could you say a little more about what these were and whether the Lord Edward employed Welshmen in administrative positions?
The Lord Edmund employed Welshmen in administrative positions.
Edward.
Oh, Edward. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, we don't have, as it were, a catalogue of the laws and the customs of the March, as I'm sure many of you are aware, which is frustrating when we're asked questions like that one, because we can't say, oh, well, here's a document, go and look at it. We have a list of them. We very much really have to take what we can find from the documents and sources. And if you're interested in the Charter of Liberties and what those liberties were, and what I would argue perhaps come very close to the customs or to the rights and the obligations of a Marcher lord, the document I mentioned before, the National Archives, Duchy of Lancaster Series 10/108, is the one to look at, because there's a whole array of rights and obligations of a Marcher lord and the expectations of a Marcher lord. And very crucially, that Charter of Liberties applies to Edmund's lands in England, but also applies to those in Wales. It's very clear in that charter that's what's going on. So I would say go if you're able, or when we are able, to visit the archives again. That's the one that you should go and look at, because that will give you a better answer than I can now in the moment, as it were.
Okay, that's it for the moment.
I think one of the sort of interesting things sort of coming out of your talk, Alastair, is sort of showing how the relationship, friendship indeed, formed between the Lord Edward and Roger Mortimer.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah.
and would continue to play a crucial role after he became king.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those questions that you sometimes get asked, you know, are most of the martial lords, or some of the martial lords that I've mentioned, are also, you know, great powerful magnates, barons in England. And, you know, I have to get asked, well, how can you separate out what they do in England from what they do in the March of Wales? Are they different people? Are they operating differently? My argument would be no, that they're not different people. They're not operating differently. I think that they see their estates in a more sort of all-encompassing and wholesome fashion than that. But no, I mean, the relationship between Roger Mortimer and the Lord Edward is a fascinating one. It has a very long history. You know, with Wilt's lordship and with the charter that I showed you as well, with the grants of land that are being made by Edward to Roger Mortimer, with what, as far as I can tell, at least as far, and certainly as I would argue, are in a way to link the two together in that specific part of the March of Wales from very early on in the Lord Edward's March of Lordship, and indeed from very early on in his career, as you like, as a leading political figure in this period. So no, absolutely fascinating, and yeah, there's much more there in the sources as well than I was able to indicate today. Yeah.
That sounds to me, Alastair, a good topic to explore in an essay to be submitted and to be entered for our next essay prize.
Right. Well, yeah, absolutely. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Yes, indeed. No, absolutely. Yes. Fair enough. No, I'll take that. I'll take it. Absolutely. Yeah, I quite agree. I quite agree.
No pressure.
I have had one
No
more.
pressure.
I have had one more question pop up if we have time.
Yep,
that's okay. I mean,
yeah.
I don't want to infringe on the time of the other speakers at all.
We've got 2 minutes.
Okay.
Right.
So Martin's iPhone has asked, you have presented Edward as cooperating well with marcher lords, especially the Mortimers. To what extent did the unpopularity of officials such as Geoffrey de Langley lead to the marchers making common cause with Welsh princes against Edward?
Wow, I mean that's 2 minutes, you say, Philip? Yeah, I mean that's one of those questions.
2.5 minutes.
Right, 2.5 minutes. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that sounds like another. You know, to go back to what you were saying, Philip, that sounds like another fantastic topic for a Mortimer History Prize essay in itself. Gosh, where to start with that one? Well, certainly the reputation, as I say, of Geoffrey de Langley, I think is very significant and is very important. The negativity in terms of his reputation, you know, I suppose that question is formulated on the basis that the March Lords didn't have stewards that were doing similar things. You know, the idea that the reason why they would have to distance themselves from Edward because they were sort of holier than thou, I think is a perhaps quite a strange assertion. It is very important, but I think this really is at the crux of the question, to state that the Marcher Lords, as they're sometimes depicted actually even in more modern accounts, are not this sort of homogenous block of people that act in unison. They do on occasion, they are able to on occasion, as I pointed out at Evesham, but these are sort of more really exceptions to the norm, I would argue. I mean, they're at each other's throats. Violence is a modus vivendi, a modus operandi in the March really during this period. The idea that, you know, their officials would not be doing anything that wouldn't be expected of them, but might not be pressing on the tenets of their marcher masters to the same extent that the Lord Edwards were, I think is quite a strange, is perhaps, I would submit, perhaps a strange assumption. It's perhaps just pointing out the work, one of these conflicts with the tenants. In Brecon, there's an incident in 1256, I think, in the summer of 1256, between Humphrey de Bohun and the Earl of Hereford and Essex, and Richard de Clare, the Earl of Gloucester and Hertford. And this is deep diving into the Welshries a bit here, and I am infringing on time, I know, I'm sorry. But the men of Brecon revolt en masse, A, because they can, and B, because they do not like what's going on at that moment in time in the Middle March under Humphrey de Bohun's, the Earl of Hereford's custodianship, if you like, or lordship. So it's not just happening with the Lord Edward and his estates, it's happening across the March. There are, if you like, the Welshries, so I should say the Welsh tenants who tend to live in the upland parts of March lordships rebel pretty much en masse. We've got loads of stuff in the sources which shows us this. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how else to unpack that apart from to say that, you know, maybe it's, as I wasn't able to convey perhaps in my talk because of constraints of time, There are other march lords are suffering just as much as the Lord Edward is in a march context. Apologies.
Yes, and perhaps there may well be time at the end if sort of Martin would like to come back to that and just
absolutely. It's a fascinating question. Yeah, I'm sorry, I've tried to answer it as best.
That's fine.